From the poorest peasant to the richest of European kings, there was a will to fight in the Crusades and reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem. The campaign was diverse, facing a wide range of terrains and multiple enemies, even managing to conquer and possess Jerusalem for a certain period. Unfortunately for the Christian kings, the campaign proved more than difficult and anticipated, and over time, city after city was lost in the battles. Unlike the Reconquista or the Baltic Crusades, the Crusades in the Levant failed. But what if history has unfolded differently? And somehow the Crusader kingdoms in the Levant had managed to survive the great incursions of their enemies. How would our history have played out? That's what we'll explore in today's video. Let those who had been robbers in the guise of knight now truly become knights. Let those who had been fighting against brothers and relatives now fight in proper ways against the infidels. The time has come for you. This is a small excerpt from Pope Urban II's speech that began the First Crusade, the Crusade of the Nobles. Its goal was to respond to the call of the Byzantine Emperor to contain the conquests of Seljuk Turks and to conquer the city of Jerusalem and the Levant. Initially, the Crusades were a success, and the Levant was conquered and transformed into various kingdoms that closely resembled European countries, lasting for about centuries. Unfortunately, poor leadership and various military geniuses on the enemy side led to decisive defeats, resulting in the loss of Jerusalem in the Third Crusade and significant amount of territory. For the Crusades to be considered a success, I will assume to the Levant would have to remain under the control of the Christian kingdoms, because of the Crusades were not a separate event. In the Baltics of Europe, there were conquests by the Teutonic Knights to convert the pagan peoples living there, especially Lithuania, and even the Reconquista of the Iberian peoples is very similar to the Crusades that took place in the Middle East. For there to be a victory, our history will have to the premise of the continuity of the kingdoms in this region after the defeat in the Third Crusade. And our story begins from there. Great military leaders like Saladin were indispensable in the victory of the Islamic empires in the reconquest of Jerusalem. Furthermore, there were many confusions among the leadership of the European kings for the conquest. The armies of Christendom, despite being numerous, were not particularly well equipped, and these forces were not in luxury to engage in disastrous campaigns like the Second Crusade, which was made to capture a city in Syria with little strategic value to maintain control of these kingdoms. Saladin became Sultan of Egypt in 1171, and this event became a milestone in our history, as it was under his military leadership that the Crusades were lost. To prevent this from happening, we must remove Saladin from our history, which wouldn't be so difficult. The reality between the members of the families was enormous. During his reign, there were several attempts of conspiracy and coups against him. One example of this was his relationship with Taqi al-Din, one of his best generals. This was something quite common at the time. So that's what happens. Discontented members of Saladin's family, along with some generals, plan a plot to dethrone Saladin and take back control of Egypt for themselves, which proves to be successful. Many people today misinterpret the Crusade as a conflict between civilizations, but the reality is that it wasn't quite like that. Often, the Islamic kingdoms and empires saw their neighbors as greater threats than the Crusader kingdoms. The relationship of many of these caliphates was pragmatic. Commitment and negotiations were preferred over extremism and extermination. Kings and princes achieved their objectives without caring much about the religion of their allies and enemies. Obviously, perspective changed over the time, but the point here is that it wasn't two civilizations fighting against each other. It was much more a struggle for influence between different kingdoms and spheres of influence. Well, one of the most infamous events of the Crusades happened in the Fourth Crusade, when the knights burned and looted the city of Constantinople, their former Byzantine allies. If the Christian kingdoms had known how to take advantage of his political fragility in the region, they could have survived without their customs, adapting to the ways of old Europe. Am I forgetting something? Oh yes, besides the various crusades to retake Jerusalem, there was a seventh crusade, led by King Louis the Nymph of France, which aimed to retake Jerusalem and all of Egypt. At first, it seemed to be going well, but after facing a much larger Egyptian force, he was defeated and captured. After being released from captivity, he went on another crusade, this time the Eighth Crusade, heading to Tunisia. Unfortunately for our soldier king, his newest enemy was dysentery, which took his life on August 25, 1270. The last crusade, the Nymph, had little impact. If our kingdoms had survived and remained somewhat sustainable, we might not have had so many crusades. Perhaps only King Louis's crusade would have occurred, and things might have continued like that over the years, until the inevitable happened, the rise of the Ottoman Empire. In a world with the Ottoman Empire, it would have been impossible for the Crusader kingdoms to survive for long. No matter what we did, at some point, the Ottomans, with vastly superior numbers of troops and modern technologies in their conflicts, would have broken the defenses of their kingdoms and conquered all the Christian territories for their Muslim empire, following the same timeline we had. To ensure our history continues successfully, we need to destroy the Ottoman Empire before it reaches its peak. And how are we going to do that? With another crusade. In 1443, a number that would be remembered by various generations to come, Vladislav III of Varna, King of Poland and Hungary, would launch a campaign to end the Ottoman Empire and save the Byzantine Empire from collapse. In 1444, a vital moment for history we know today would occur: the Polish king and his men against the Ottoman forces led by a young sultan. What happened there will determine the future of Europe forever. Either the Ottomans would be expelled from the continent and the old kingdoms would be restored, or Europe would suffer wave after wave of Turkish attacks through generations. The final result was the defeat of coalition forces and the death of Vladislav III. After this, the already weakened Byzantine Empire fell, marking the end of the Eastern Roman Empire. From then on, the Turks would become Europe's biggest headache for the next 300 years. If this campaign had succeeded, we could have avoided the rise of the Ottomans, and it is from this point that we make our divergence. The new crusade, led by the Poles and their king alongside geniuses like John of Runiad, begins their attempt to save Europe from Turkish hordes. Thus begin the Battle of Varna, which in our reality is won by the Christian coalition. Murad II is killed in battle, and the defeat in this battle ensures the liberation of the Balkans. The Crusader kingdoms up to this point were small clusters of cities defended by a complex system of fortifications that had so far prevented them from being expelled. Unprosperous during the period of peace between Arabs and Turks, they now faced a unique, fierce enemy that had not been seen before. But the lessons learned from previous conflicts, along with a brief moment of peace and prosperity, gave the noble knights the intelligence and hope needed to defend the territory. As a legacy, one of the greatest walls built up until that point would stand, second only to that of Constantinople. More than 300 years of conflict led to the Levantine kingdoms to build various defensive systems to protect their populations. Even after centuries of battles, the walls of Jerusalem had never been penetrated by the enemy. It seemed that their fall was inevitable, but with the Turkish defeat, these same kingdoms, previously confined behind the walls, began to launch attacks aiming to free the Ottoman territories. having to deal with conflicts on multiple fronts. The Crusader kingdoms achieved decisive victories, capturing strategic points to rehabilitate their nations. Meanwhile, the situation within Ottoman Empire was calamitous. The defeat and death of the Sultan left a power vacuum that could not be filled, leading various regional leaders to take up arms against the new Sultan. The Ottomans fell into conflict between their various tribes. The empire, which once seemed like an unstoppable force, crumbled, and the Christian kingdoms expanded. Thus, the Ottoman influence that had shaped Europe for generations faded into a small chapter in European history. Finally, we succeeded in ensuring the survival of the Crusader states, but as you can see, we made a small change in the world. Just a little one. Does this mean that without the fall of Constantinople, the Portuguese would have ventured out the sea and the New World would have never been discovered? Not quite. The fall of Constantinople did give the Portuguese impetus to set sail, but it wasn't the only reason. There was also a significant rivalry between the Iberian kingdoms and the Republic of Venice, which was at the time the most powerful nation in the spice trade. Even without the fall of Constantinople, the Portuguese would still have improved their ships and eventually sailed out to sea, although this may have taken a few more years. Yes, these would change how the Americas were colonized. In reality, I imagine that the Americas would have been discovered by the Portuguese as they attempted to reach India via an alternate route, trying to break Venice's monopoly. Another considerable change is that the Balkan countries, which had been under Ottoman rule for around 400 years, such as Bulgaria, Wallachia, and Hungary, would have been independent since the Middle Ages. These would have had major impacts on global history, as these countries would have been significant players in European politics during the early modern period. How would these countries handle on the 13 Years' War or the Protestant Reformation? The truth is, they wouldn't handle it directly. If we look closely, the Ottomans being considered the sick man of Europe wasn't necessarily due to Ottoman politics. It was that Western Europe grew much faster than the rest of the world, first through colonization and then eventual industrialization. Even without the Ottomans, this part of the world would have lost some of its relevance. Instead of the Ottomans being the sick man of Europe, the Byzantines, Serbs, and Bulgarians would have occupied that role. And that's where our history could end, because it's impossible to predict the results of new conflicts that would inevitably arise. How this small time period could have altered the colonization of the Americans and how these kingdoms would have interacted with European politics is impossible to predict. I know how you people are, and I know you want to see how these kingdoms would look in modern times, so I will continue this story forward. But keep in mind that history would have changed at such point that from here it will be more of an exploration with ideas that don't necessarily make much sense, more speculation than reality. But stick around, because there will be a lot of interesting things to explore. As I said before, this part of Europe would have developed much faster than the rest. Over time, the Crusading spirit faded with the Europeans, and launching conquest battles was no longer a central focus. So we can say that much of our history would continue somewhat similarly, passing through the instabilities of the modern age, going through Napoleon, and eventually reaching the rise of Romanticism and nationalism in Europe. These ideas would also reach and affect the Crusader kingdoms and the idea of having one unified kingdom encompassing these territories wouldn't be absurd, would it be? If England would try to stop these ideas somehow. One country that would benefit a lot in this reality is Russia. Without the Ottoman Empire as a thorn in its side, Russia would only have to deal with smaller kingdoms. Russia's rise in this part of the globe would have been much easier. There wouldn't have been as many conflicts in this region.
So without Crimean conflict between the Allies and Russia, this area would have had less strategic value in the eventual world conflicts, both for the German and the Allies. The Balkans in general would have been more important and could have changed the course of conflicts. But again, let's say nothing changed and everything continued as in our history today. The various kingdoms established during the Middle Ages would look very different. Culturally, they would be very distinct from the Europeans. This was something that had already been seen in our reality, where in just a few years of rule in this region, people who moved there no longer saw themselves as Europeans, but rather as Levantine Christians. 800 years of history would have made these people quite distinct, somewhat like the people of the Caucasus. Although they are close to Europeans, centuries of separate customs make many people question how much they truly belong to Europe. Today, we wouldn't have the conflicts that exist in this region because, well, I don't think I need to say much about that. But these kingdoms, despite being created as they were, would be quite diverse, with a significant number of Muslims and Jews living there. Despite being separated from one another, this would also have an effect on America. Yeah, it wouldn't be impossible to have a president with ancestry from the Kingdom of Jerusalem. I can easily see a huge immigration of people living in those areas to America during the golden age of immigration. How would their relationships with neighbors look? That's hard to say. It depends a lot on what happened between the wars. If there had been a massive partition of European countries, as in our reality, it's quite possible there would have been a lot of rivalry between their neighbors, but not for the reasons you might think, based on medieval crusades, but rather for modern reasons, involving geopolitics of these regions. Economy, population, it's impossible to predict, but it would likely be a mix of the Caucasus and the Middle East. Even though the Crusades are so mythologized, the reality is that if these countries had survived, the people in this reality wouldn't think much about how strange their founding was or how different the world could have been if the Crusades hadn't succeeded. Overall, as I said halfway through the video, there comes a point when everything we try to predict becomes more speculative and a product of our imagination than anything else. But let me know in the comments what you think, and what do you think would have happened if the Crusades had succeeded. Also, leave ideas for future videos. I read everything. Subscribe to this channel and stay alive. That's it.